I was really pleased to get this commission, in fact. I've done a lot of choral pieces over the years, so many at one stage that I decided I didn't want to do any for a long time. But then suddenly this came along and I realised that I had kind of missed it, and I really, was ever so pleased to be doing another vocal piece. It's a several years gap between this one and the previous one, so it came along just at the right moment. It was also a sort of breathing space in a much bigger project that I was working on for completely different ensembles, and I wanted to have a break from that. So a very small scale composition was exactly what was needed at the time. So thank you, Queen. It's true that I've always been interested in architecture, in actual fact. For me, structure and the design and the proportions and the actual shape of a building is very closely related to how I view music. And when I start a composition, I tend to start with the plan, the architecture, and then gradually fill in the details later. They're very closely related, the two art forms. They both have rhythm to them. Architecture has, an architect will talk about the rhythm of a building. He will also talk about a cacophonous building, which is well, Prince Charles did anyway, which is a very musical term, of course. And musicians talk about structure and light and shade and materials in their music. So incredibly close. And in a sense, you go through a journey in each art form too. You walk through a building or an arcade, you make a start and you come out at the end. And this is very much what happens in music. You start at the beginning of the piece, you go through, you hear it, and hopefully by the time you come out at the end, you're slightly changed by the experience. And so I think very close relation really between architecture and music, and I have a great interest in both, of course, in the architecture particularly. Music is my work, but architecture I just love looking at and thinking about. It was a great experience for me last autumn to have a complete performance of my great big pieces for organ and harmonium and accordion with various ensembles done. It's called The Hours, and based on the ancient liturgical offices of the church from the early morning right through to Compline late at night. And it was done in 3 separate concerts. Otherwise it would have been about 2.5 hours of pure burrell, which is too much for anybody, I think. So 3 concerts, about an hour each, interspersed with plain song, and it was a totally wonderful experience. There comes that moment when you've got to face that piece of blank manuscript paper, instead of waffling around making yet another cup of coffee and thinking, oh, maybe I've got a bit of time tomorrow. There does come that moment, you must sit down and face it. With this particular commission, of course, you have a starting point, which is the text. And I usually spend a very long time finding a text, but I sort of knew what I wanted almost immediately. I'd been working on this great big piece, The Hours, and had just completed Vespers, which is the evening office. And I began to think it would be lovely to do something for an evening service. And of course, the most ancient service the early Christians had was the lamp lighting ceremony, Lucinarium. And this hymn, which is a translation really of the old Greek for Silaran, is the hymn that was used at that ceremony. It was a wonderful kind of ceremony. Every single lamp and candle was lit in the building and incense was swung about and people just gathered together. There was quite a sort of sense of energy, I think, in the early church. And as soon as I thought of that, I was away. The manuscript paper, I won't say filled itself with notes, if only, but I did manage to feel quite inspired on this particular occasion. I like writing for anything really and everything. This particular piece is purely a cappella, just 4 vocal parts, but I've written a great deal of orchestral music and chamber music and things for solo instruments. I've written quite a lot really. I've been around a long time. I think I love whatever it is I'm writing for at the moment. So in my big organ project, I got really quite obsessed with the organ and be happy not to write for that anymore, but to write for something else. I loved writing the clarinet concerto. I think wind instruments have a particular colour. They're like creatures, they're like human beings really. They breathe and they speak. But then I love strings, and writing the viola concerto was wonderful because there's such an expressive power in that. So really, whatever makes a lovely noise, really, I'm very happy to write for. I did make reference to the Queen earlier, thanking her very much for this commission. I think she's presided over an incredibly interesting time in British history, European history really, and particularly it shows in the arts. At the beginning of her reign, it was a very, very different style of music that was being written here. We then went through some really exciting modernist years when there were some amazing pieces written, and now it's, I think, kind of softened again a little bit. People want a slightly different style of music, again, something perhaps a little bit easier. It fills me with a little bit of sadness, that I have to say, because I loved the sort of the late 20th century and the kind of pieces that were being written, and I don't want to ever lose that excitement and that sense of newness in my own work, and I don't like to see it in others. So I hope I can keep exploring and trying things out. As soon as I feel safe, then I think it's time to give up. I get bored. I want to go on to the next thing always.